right, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. We're going to get ahead of the game a little bit and get this video out early. Quiz number 4 is done. Next Friday, please finish your assignment on the American contradiction. And yeah, smooth sailing after that. Just we have to do chapter 7, and as I said, chapter 8 really needs some work, and we'll, if we have time, we'll discuss it, but there's really not, as I recall, a whole bunch of things on the exam. I just finished preparing the exam this afternoon, and I didn't include anything from chapter 8. If I change that, then of course you'll be the first people to know. I found my awesome little remote control thing, so I don't have to move back and forth between my cameras. So small upgrade there. And we don't have we don't have a gigantic amount of stuff to cover. I think we're on pace to get through most of the book. What I talk about today will require some reading in order to fully understand all the relationships between these things, because it kind of, what I've written on the board are the key points. But I am going to talk to you about how they fit together and why in this new edition, chapter 5 and chapter 6 were swapped. They changed order. So don't forget what I said to you on Friday about colonization and imperialism. Don't forget about how the Irish were the most extensive, at least in terms of time, the longest victims, to a certain extent, the first victims of the Anglo-Norman, what would become the United Kingdom. They were sort of, I called it the dress rehearsal for imperialism or colonization, because part of the tragedy about the Irish people was that justification of cultural differences and religious differences and linguistic differences were the justification for dominating and in sometimes killing them. They were often allied with the Spanish or the French or whoever they could persuade to support them. But if you look at the geography from the very beginning of the book, Ireland is, Scotland and the main Isle of Britain blocks Ireland fairly effectively from getting direct help from their continental friends. So Spain and France often try to help Irish rebellions, but Ireland never was really unified, and that was part of the problem. The native people in North America were not unified. The original Britons that were conquered by the Romans, the tribes were fighting each other, and some of them made friends with the Romans and some of them didn't, and they were fighting each other at the same time. This lack of organization just made it possible for the complete domination of the British Isles in the first place, and this was the same situation in Ireland. They were not led by a single strong government, which England had for hundreds and hundreds of years. So they were always at a disadvantage. Smaller population, less allies, and less wealthy, behind eventually in technology, and constantly having to try and break free of British imperialism. So there are many countries in the world that were victims of the British imperial policy. The Irish have one of the best cases for resentment. So moving on to today, what we need to talk about mainly is industrialization. In the textbook, it quickly goes from how the superpower Not a true global superpower, as I said. America is the only one that's really been that so far. But after colonizing Ireland and then starting to develop colonies overseas, in the Caribbean, in America, and then moving, into India and Asia, eventually adding Australia to their empire, New Zealand, eventually South Africa. This process begins. Part of the reason, as I said, is the industrial capacity, the technological and productive advantage that was provided by the industrialization process, the revolution that happened in England. I'm not going to get into specifically why it happened in England. There's lots of theories about that, but part of it was simply that they needed they were highly literate, just like the Scottish. They were developing things, inventions for certain things to increase power and productivity, because it was the competition with other European competitions was fierce, and the only real way that they could compete with the French Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, and other empires was to develop in industrial productivity and capacity, and secondly, to focus on the ocean and ship technology and economic domination, trade, and preventing, when the great continental wars happened, the United Kingdom was largely able to avoid all the damage to their buildings, infrastructure, roads, loss of people, and they're not participating with huge armies normally. What they're doing is patrolling the seas and controlling communication, and they usually, whichever side they choose, they're sort of like to be the people that if they lean one way, then this tips the balance in the favor of one side or another. So they like to be the ones, sort of the arbiters of the conflict. They don't want to be the main belligerent. If it's France versus Germany, they either stay out of it or they take a side and try to balance it or give the advantage to one side or another. So it's on the ocean, and their extensive networks of trade and ships that are there already. But what the Industrial Revolution starts with is taking weaving, which is a mainstay of the British economy, the English economy, and the Scottish. So we can say British. Wool was the primary material that was used, but cotton was much more comfortable and much more expensive. But once cotton was starting to be planted instead of tobacco in America, the Civil War really was a fight over the South trying to keep their slave plantations running, because that's what the economy was based on. They exported huge amounts of cotton, enormous amounts of cotton. Most of it went to the United Kingdom, but a large amount of it went to the North, because the northern states, Pennsylvania and New York and Maryland and the New England states in general, they were all beginning to industrialize too, maybe about 20 years or 30 years behind the British. But when the slave plantations collapse and the Civil War is over, the British look for cotton and they plant it in India and other parts of their colonies so they can continue. But the fundamental factors that needed to be there for the way that the British did it, subsequent industrial revolutions have happened differently. But the weaving machine, something called a spinning jenny, was something that multiplied the force of a human being's productivity. Once they started being able to add things to it, for example, instead of using human power, they're using machines to multiply how fast somebody could produce cloth. And then as a consequence, all the things that cloth could be used for, things made of cotton, uniforms for soldiers, obviously in high demand, just a massive influx of cheap cloth that can be used for everything: curtains, bed sheets, uniforms, you know, padding for things, pillows, everything. These textiles are finished. What happens is the cotton gets refined. It sort of gets, there's a cotton gin that is invented that sort of separates the cotton into the, you know, the sort of purified cotton without all the extra contaminants in it. Once they start getting this high quality cotton, which is good quality cotton from America. This is why the British and the Americans continue to be friends, even though they fight a war and the Americans win. The economic relationship between them is very. It's the America needs to trade with Britain. They desperately need to grow their economy and they need customers. And the British have the technology and they have started to begin this process of basically turning machines, humans into, instead of humans into handmade, you know, sort of craftsmen, turning them into operators. They end up becoming operatives. Sometimes we call factory workers factory hands, because I mean, what you're doing is you're basically manipulating a machine. The technology for stronger materials, especially iron, we're not working with steel yet. The machines are made out of iron, not out of wood, which causes fires and it breaks easily and stuff. Ironworking was a key factor for making the machines. The product that was produced was textiles coming from cotton. And once they figured out how to, boil water, use a boiler, heat it up, and get the steam to produce energy by spinning turbines, you ended up, instead of using what people had been using for thousands of years, the most powerful thing really was a horse. Before the machines came along, so horsepower, ox power, donkeys, humans. This is the sort of animal power source that you could have. Of course, there were better options, windmills and water mills. Also were great sources of power and energy, but you would have to you'd have to have a river and you'd have to have a mill that was available, and that happened a lot. That's a really, really effective and cheap way of getting energy. But steam power can be used anywhere, as long as you have coal and as long as you have wood to keep the furnace hot, to boil water. As long as that's available, you can do it anywhere, and that's what they started to do. Eventually, there's steam-powered ships, and eventually there's pumps, steam-powered pumps to pump water out of mines that are getting flooded, and then there's railroads, and then then they start to adapt their fleets to using steam power, and eventually, the 20th century, then they started to develop combustion engines and other powers. So mineral oil powered things came later. But the first industrial revolution, these are the three factors you got to remember. Part of what made all this possible is that Adam Smith, a really smart Scottish guy, argued that free market economy was much better than this sort of government managed, guild oriented, archaic economic system. What we really should be doing is that we should let private people run their businesses and make their own businesses as efficient as possible, and this will be beneficial for everyone. This is somewhat controversial because the way Adam, it's called The Wealth of Nations, the famous book that he wrote about it. It's fascinating, it's worth reading, but it gets a lot more complicated when international things are involved. And nowadays, when you have supply chains and you have resources that particular countries have, it doesn't make it easy for you to just have a free economy, especially when there's political things involved. So it's a kind of idealized situation where everybody would be able to compete sort of on equal footing, but we all know that's not the case. There's advantages that are given or taken, geographical advantages, and of course the political favoritism or conflict between countries, or scarce resources, negotiations, all these things. It's a lot more complicated than Adam Smith proposed. So there's a certain amount of, but he is considered the sort of proponent of stopping what they call the mercantile system, which was you're only sort of trying to protect your own country and get as much gold into your country as you can. This is why people are concerned that Donald Trump is trying to do this, like tax everybody else and try and not gold necessarily, but keep the wealth in the United States as much as possible. That ends up making everybody poorer and everything more expensive, though. That's the consequence of having that system. So these empires like the French, who taxed everything coming in and subsidized everything going out, this is China's economic policy, and it seems to be blowing up in their face right now. So if America starts doing this, I expect the same thing to happen. You can't make your products cheaper and make everybody else's expensive and not expect trade to break down and everybody, especially us, the consumers, to pay higher prices. So that's all tied into the Industrial Revolution, the commercial revolution, the financial revolution, the agricultural revolution, which you should read about here. This provides the environment for the British to be the first. They also have coal. They also have iron available. They get the technology from the Swedish in this case. And so they're the first ones to start to make rapid progress. 100 years after it starts in 1850, their economy will have grown so much, their productive capacity will, and their reach, global reach of their trade networks with their ships will have grown so much that they become the biggest economy in the world, and they will pass China. The Qing dynasty, I believe, is the last one. And in 1850, they will have a larger economy than the most populous country in the world, the Qing Empire, the Chinese, which is remarkable. So some of this information is right in the book. You have to look it up. There's upsides to the Industrial Revolution and there's downsides, just like everything else. Lots more stuff, cheaper, lots of wealth for people, but generally most of the wealth ends up in the hands of the people who are owners. This is why Karl Marx didn't like capitalism, because if you were the factory owner, then you made tons of money and you worked your factory workers as hard as you could and paid them as little as you could in order to make more money and build more factories and so on until you were just so filthy rich you didn't know what to do with it. So class conflict and the owners of production. We're not going to talk about Marx, and I know lots of people aren't big fans of communism, but Karl Marx had a good point. It's not like all of this, everybody got benefits from this. Really hard work had to be done. They usually worked 6 days a week. They had 70-hour work weeks. Even South Korea, which is famous for having working too much, is nothing compared to working 70 hours in a factory. I worked 50 hours in a factory when I was in university, and it was miserable. And I didn't go home to a tiny little row house with barely enough food and just black smoke all over the, a cloud of black smoke over the city, and no chance for vacation. And I went back to university after I did my factory work. These people would have to do this for years, and there were no safety, there was no helmets, there was no boots. Children were employed. In fact, small children were needed sometimes because you couldn't get into the machine to repair something or retrieve something or stop something. So they sent little kids into the machine to make sure the machine was still working. And I mean, I don't know what you want to, that's child abuse. We don't do that intentionally. Most countries it's illegal. And also it's dangerous because crawling into a machine, obviously they would probably be turning it off at the time, but there's chemicals everywhere, and there's no guardrails, there's no railings, all the things that every factory would have now to prevent people from losing fingers and feet and falling to their death in a big, bucket of glue, weren't there. So this is definitely the downside. We also know that climate change is largely it's almost all caused by, now China is industrialized and they've surpassed the Europe, the EU, in all-time emissions. The United States is number 1, and China is number 2, and the EU is number 3 all time. So we've got 3 massive countries. India is trying to catch up too. The more countries that industrialize and use fuel that causes pollution, the faster our Earth is going to die, and we're going to die with it. So there's a scary. I don't want to be too negative, but that I think about this all the time. We've got to start, especially the countries who have already industrialized, they're post-industrialized. We've got to find a way to be more conscious of what the effect on the earth is of all the products that we're doing. Not just making money, but being conscious of environmental consequences of everything we do. The agricultural revolution was very important because there was a guy, you'll have to read this on page 201, but Reverend Malthus was not very popular because he came up with this theory that the population was increasing so fast that soon they were going to run out of food and there was going to be mass starvation, immigration, war, and collapse of society because it was going to be so catastrophic lack of food production. However, fertilizer, machines, understanding of chemistry, rotating crops, new lands, the massive agricultural production of countries like China and the United States, with all the different varieties of plants and vegetables and fruit that they could produce, the grains. The Columbian Exchange had managed to spread all these seeds all over the world, and we have these seeds that are, resistant to certain types of things like cold, or they grow better in certain climates. GMO is all over the place, and this has allowed our population to continue to grow very fast, and the food production to keep up with it. But Reverend Malthus is not completely dead. He's dead, but his idea is not completely dead. we people are anticipating that climate change itself and the way that we've overburdened the earth with 8 billion people, and the number of people farming and the amount of sustainable agriculture we have is dropping now, that there's going to be his projected intersection point is going to happen in the next few decades, and then we're going to have massive issues with how to feed our populations, right? Okay, so sea power right in the middle. Sea power is really, I already spoke about it. It's the means to which the Pax Britannica, the British Empire, and the domination of global sea lanes occurred. In particular, you have to read about this guy, Admiral Nelson. I'll tell you some interesting stories about these people, but I just want you to read about this stuff to prepare yourself. Next Friday, I'll talk about these guys and tell you some interesting stories about them, just to help you remember. But Admiral Horatio Nelson, he was one of the greatest ship captains and admirals, commanders, naval commanders of all time. He is often called, Yi Sun-shin is often called the Nelson of Korea. There's some comparisons that can be made there. Lots of differences in personality and circumstances, but both extremely brave and key to defending their nations. Nelson defending the United Kingdom, the British Empire, from the French Empire under Napoleon, and Yi Sun-shin defeating the Japanese fleet that was trying to take over Chosun and then attack Beijing. So we'll talk about Nelson on Friday a bit more. Same thing with Charles Dickens and Victoria and Jane Austen. These are the last things in the chapter. So these people are the ones that end up finishing off chapter 6, and I think they need a little bit of explanation, but I do a pretty good job of just summarizing what they're all about. Dickensian is a term. It has a lot to do with the dark side of the Industrial Revolution. If you've ever heard of Oliver Twist or Hard Times or Great Expectations, it's all about capitalism and class and factories and the poor and the class domination, the gap between the rich and the poor in Victorian England, in the British Empire, how some individuals in the empire were colonized. Some of them were not British citizens, but even those who were in the United Kingdom suffered a lot. On the other hand, the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution provided a lot more food and a lot more nourishment. So as the pollution and emissions and safety and danger and low wages and hard work was happening, there was also an improvement in overall health and life expectancy that went up. So some people are sort of look at that and say it wasn't a complete failure of a system, because it ultimately, not at the time necessarily, but led to all of these modern improvements. The Victorian period is a quite strange place. It's a combination of old and new, and rich and poor, and technology, and old traditions, conservatives, and strange progressive liberal behaviors. Victorian England is a fascinating place. I think it's another one of those places like America that's full of contradictions. But nonetheless, the British Empire grew to its greatest extent, and on the outside, on the surface at least, it looked like the most impressive. It looked like the most impressive empire of its day, and it turned out to be the largest empire in history. So the Industrial Revolution was something that people had to suffer through, but there were benefits and demerits. Obviously, economic boom, the country as a whole becoming much richer state, able to compete with other countries that are larger, and to provide employment and generally better nutrition and better. You can tell simply by the fact that British people started to get taller in the 19th century. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, people became taller, and that's a matter of having better nutrition. So starvation started to become less and less of an issue. Part of this is because a lot of food could be imported from Canada, United States, Australia. So the British, the United Kingdom was the hub of all of these economic activities. And the combination of the sea power and the industrial strength was what allowed them to do that. So Jane Austen is, I think, the only writer other than Elizabeth I that I talk about, and I didn't really talk about her writing, but she does write. But I'll talk about Jane Austen as a writer. Charles Dickens is a writer, very famous. Lots of movies. There's 100 different movies you can watch about Charles Dickens if you prefer to not read 1,000 pages about Oliver Twist or the Tale of Two Cities or whatever the case may be. And we'll talk about Queen Victoria as a person and what it means. The first half of the 19th century for the British was essentially Dickensian, and the second half was Victorian. Okay, and I have some things to mention about Nelson too. So we'll do that character stuff, and then on Friday it'll be time for the 20th century finally, and that will be almost exclusively talking about the 20th century as the rise of the American global superpower, its participation in World War I and II, the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, and all the things that will become more familiar with you. The recent past, the last 100 years of America, that's what Chapter 7 is about, and that's why it's called 20th Century Boy. I can't play songs on my videos because I get copyrighted, but 20th Century Boy by T-Rex is a fun little rock song back from when I was a child, back from the early 80s or late 70s, and they usually have it in the Notebang, so if you learn how to sing it, you can impress your friends with your English. That's why it's called the 20th century. Okay, I think that's it. No quiz next week, so just keep your notes going on these videos. We've got a couple left and a couple more classes, and we have an exam, and that's all there is to it. Good luck on your assignment. Talk to you next time. Or is it going to let me do it? Might have to walk this one out.